야 tani nga tsu terang yang thang nipa larse pemzo kanga na la yong ne tani namba tsota nyamda tani kabda shiya ga tani korkup shunga la nga pe gabo shung sung tani shirtang nanang thang tangbo tani nupshuk la yong tani talo thang nipa re ti nang la shirtang ga tani nga so boba mambo ta tuk sung tani nga so bobe mangchok tani bobe loma tani popi tani lama tisokoro ati mambo zutukso tani mambo tani kapda tani mambo shia korko shonsong nga pe kapo shonsong.
So this is my second time now to be able to visit the Latsi Library, and I'm very happy to have this second chance to come and be in conversation with you all again. So this is my second trip to the West, and on this trip I've had the opportunity to meet with and chat with many Tibetans, ordinary Tibetans, students, lamas, etc.
Di nala nga zo kabda mambo dini shia korkup dini yakbo raksong. Di na dini nga rang la samlo tangbayi na nga zo shilo la yongkang ka dini bobatso ka dini netang. Shidang nga ma la tana tarta nga zo mambo go re, shidang nga zo chawi tone go re, di mayimbi yang dini gilam mambo yo re, dini nga zo nang la yo bi, dini popi nitsar, dini nga zo shilo la yongkang zo yang mambo go re, dini shilo la yongkang ka nitsar nga zo yang mambo go re. Rede ina da nga zo shila yung ni ngusi dini yang nga zo mi ngot ni kaldashi yang rawo dini yang rawo ma re. Tendri yendi tendri ko kolka mambo zo tendri shonsong tendri kabda yang mambo shejira song tendri kabda kapsa tendri ngarang chapsi ko kola ngarang tendri kabda shetam ko mare sheka me te mato bajan ba nga so ringne ko koronrata chowa ko koronrata tendri chu koronrata tsola kabda mambo shia kolka raksong tendri ngarang pe tendri ta lo tsumbon rawo tendri shonsong.
So in terms of the situation of Tibetans living outside Tibet now, and the situation of Tibetans living inside Tibet, nowadays we know more of both of these situations than we previously did. And the reason for this is that we now have the internet and other ways of finding out about the situation in both places. So even though we now do have these ways to find out more about the situation of Tibetans both inside and outside Tibet, it's quite a different thing to actually meet people and be able to talk with them face to face. So on this trip I've had many opportunities to do this, to have many conversations with Tibetans. I've not of course been able to talk about politics or discuss politics, but anything besides this, such as everyday life, culture, religion, etc., these are all topics that we've been able to talk about with each other, and I've felt very happy and satisfied with these conversations.
Teni kyabrta terang aso pemzo kangana la teni yoni kavdashia teni korkushon wala yang ngarang laparda gayo nanang rawi na nga so pemjo kandi nala yone tani karzi korla te kavda yin tani terang rawi na te nga so chunju ko korla tani kavda rindu kal taryang pemjo kandi zi yo pala ngarang pe jisi yarang shege yo nga so tani popi shuchoko nala nge mangchola tani kavda shidi te namgin shedde yo nga so tani loso te chimsang loso ta tani 로자가 로소다 되니 수속을 로소제 된 잠발라 로소 심데 백가치 슈츠요리 디나니 되니 뱀주 칸다이나 되니 수속을 로소 나라 되니 요리 되니 가서 수속을 로소 되베 가친 버레 마토 방아서 겸상걸 로소다 되니 수속을 로소 되니 돌아식 잠 마트나 되니 가서 로작지 보고 나네 되니 다시도 당럽 그르니 망보장 탑고 요리 장고리 카페가친 버레 제디나 가서 수수랑거 teni pobi rigne de jangona nga so kimsanga teni losoda shusoko losoniga so mashina tele jang nga so tarta nga so boba rang teni lobtazi ya teris yo mare teni nga rang pe kar chimbon thongyo teni indi nga so boba ga teni nyenkor la teni ta tongchirin din la yongke na re gangyen nga so pemjo kang de lan teni pemjo kang yo bate le la boz mare teni na tela japkyur te yakpo she go ndu yapkyur zena nga so kandiz la ko alen ko rezena pemzo khangzya te teni khorang ga rentang de gang re zina teni ga so mi jamba chola par teni pecha teni taya teni ga teni khundum shia ga teni de khorang ga teni rentang ri teni indi ta nga so de pemzo khang yo na teni tangking ga mi ma yo na teni yang pemzo khang yo na de rentang me ban zhawo teni chang zhawo re teni indi nga so de la gyapchur shi zia de pemzo khang la yong ne teni ngus pecha teni lomnir shia yin na ri yana chathokla teni pemzo khang ga teni chi shi go pecha lomnir shia teni yo na dinang la ya po teni de chama jiya de nge samlo ta ka pe kar chim bodri sam go yo.
So I'm particularly happy to be able to come to this library. Last year when I came, I spoke about vegetarianism in Tibet, and this year I'm going to be talking about largely my dictionary work. In any case, being able to come here and be in this library is something that I'm very happy about. I really rejoice in the existence of this library. Wherever I've traveled recently in the West and have spoken with Tibetans, I've emphasized the importance of 3 types of education in respect of preserving and advancing Tibetan culture, primarily family education, school education, and social or society level education. And a library like this is really corresponds with a society level of education. So it's these 2 areas, social education and family education, that we really need to work hard on in respect of preserving and advancing Tibetan culture. Of course, in schools we learn a lot of modern subjects and modern contemporary knowledge, and of course this is important. But for Tibetan society, our society level or collective education and family education are really important, because we don't at this stage have a school that is specifically dedicated to Tibetan culture. But that a library like this exists is not something that happens easily at all, and so it's important that it be supported properly. That which we call a library is the value of such a place is providing a space for people to come and be able to read books and resources, and without people looking after it properly, it's very difficult for it to survive. So whether it be in terms of a place to read real books or virtual books or whatever the case may be, a library like this is an important place and should be supported.
머르 치글라 삼로 땅바yen na rigniti pe karchim borin de tinga su sama go yo re tarta teni nga su sama nga su pe na pog nang la na ta ngama ina nga su teni jang jok mang chok nang la teni nga su rigniti la teni ko tang zam mo teni len tham khanda ma tham khanda te mambu yo re te indi rigni song shu re nyam so re ginzan re de so ko la teni ko yak pu yong khen yo re mang chi wa su ko yo ma re 인나 다르다다이나 배나가 저 보건당라이나 어당가 저 rigni티 pe karchim borindu rigni티 인담다 송추시 고온두 삼반라오티 보거데니 자와다 데니 시움바가 데카간 나라데 레용가마니 요리다 데 망초고 나라이나 당가서 셔당금 쪽바다 셔당가 롱와다 데순나라티 코토데 야산니 뱅아마다 만자위티니 게르와 야보타니 가서 보건당라양 조요리.
So for a people or an ethnicity, culture is extremely important. This is something that we all know. In the past, however, this awareness among farmers and nomads in Tibet, that is the awareness or understanding of the need for preserving and maintaining and advancing Tibetan culture maybe wasn't so strong, of course, among intellectuals and those with a significant degree of education, as well as among the monastic community. There was a stronger awareness. However, these days in society, this awareness is also starting to really pervade ordinary Tibetans as well. So this understanding of the importance of Tibetan culture is also reaching farming communities and nomadic communities as well.
Teni ngazo rigniti karchimbo indi ti tsawade katang ikela teni thugde yore pena ngazo katang igete kangda wozre ngazo jamso nala teni roya zhang tenra pozre tani te maimbi tini rinni te so tini zhagzang tola yonkan tani moda tani ngubo chongzi tsun rapos re tani indi pe na ga zo zhagzang te tani jamso go nangla tani nabni mepa chaksona tani ti tola yonkan mo re ti tola yonkan tani ngubo re chama jamso kablan jone tani tata ga zo jamso shotang lan jong ken so tani lo jibja kong lo ngabja kong lo smja kong la tani jamso go nangla nabni tani ngobo mambo tin chotang la hone de yong ken so tata yar kerong ndo wa denja po rekare te nga so tini kadang yige tini ka magashi sati tini nga so rigne te de thya chawane yo mare te chama ha ko re
In terms of culture, the language, oral language, spoken language, and written language is extremely important. Again, something that everyone is no doubt aware of. It's, in fact, language is like a boat on the ocean. And culture and people are like the objects, the cargo, or the passengers on the boat. And if the boat is to sink, then everything that it is carrying also sinks with it into the ocean. So we have cases of great ships in the past, 300 or 400 years ago, that sunk in the ocean, and all of the different things they were carrying went down with them. And so we now have people going down and retrieving these things. So this is just what it is like with a language. If it dies or if it sinks, then so too does the culture that is suspended on it.
tani tirib nyesha ba dinala tan roma thak ba tirib dinala tani zambalang ka kar tongchak chigdang chig makashin de tani me pa chasong ngama rawo ina nga chu me mamboz ka o ka ta yige ta me pa chak ji ki mare samne tani samde gare makon khen so tani samde gare jete ina te me pa chak jindu kal ina korang la kiyandu gayandu chewandu nga zo kirga nanchi zi naji yangdu teni nga zo karigla teni kirga nanchi jipo tendu nga zo mula kirga nanchi jipo yo bata chikpari teni yige lang te tang rapondu teni yige lang kirga nanchi jipo ndu teni tenri yinna teni nga zo kai teni gege yore zina gege yo mare nga zo kai la teni lorgi hali baga rang bumundu yinna yang teni nga zo kai naga yore teni tan china hako mare teni ti thola pe nga zo zabzab shik gosare.
In the 20th century, more than 1,000 languages in the world became extinct. And this was something at the time that people didn't think was possible, that languages could vanish just like this. But they did vanish, and they're continuing to vanish. Languages, just like humans, they come into existence, they are born, they age, they become sick, and they die too. And this, in terms of the Tibetan language, we are clearly not in a period of being born. It's a language with significant history. However, we are in a period where the language, we could say, is ailing. Whether it will die or not, that's another question.
tani nga so bola ka khis yo ta ta navi phanlan chi zingri tani navi kapse tani te tela pamchu jab gore pamchu chi ne tani te na te yak po taksona tani khorang taksong re ma to ba te ma to na ti jila kare re jna te navi jilan chware te ma to ba jamba yo mari tani yindi nga chu ka tarong chig ndu jna mandu po gangjeng ka kan chig mandu ina na ndu o te ti yindi nga chu samala gan yo re gan yo ti samala semkri she go ndu.
So there's a saying in Tibetans that says that whilst when something needs to be healed when it is sick, after the it's too late to heal something after a being has died, and this is the same with a language too. While we are in this stage of where our language is suffering or our language is ailing, it's important that we do something now while we still have time.
Pola ko tini pechata tini yikcha ga wang de shina pena ga zoda pola tini mi chang mangbo mari zambalang ga thoni mrik chola darna hajang nyongshu de yang mari hajang mangshu de kala yinda da sherdang nyongshu jabji ina da ngarang chole yang nyongwi mrik tini yang mangbo yo re chi nyongshu de mari da ina nyongyong go jabde re tini indi tini majang nyongyong tini zita darna tini nga cho tini pecha ta nga chu tini bog tini pecha ta dang tini yigi de dang ngaso matang ni ka darna tin zambalang na la tini pecha mangshu ga tini murg ti reason ni tini zegi yore pecha ngaso taya mangbondu
Even though we Tibetans are we aren't a huge population, we're not the smallest population or the smallest ethnicity on earth, and yet we are still a relatively small ethnicity. There are not many of us. Nevertheless, relative to the size of our population, it is said that we have the highest rate of books or the highest number of books relative to the size of our population. So as a people, we have many books and texts.
베나 ngaso 모동 반친 그때니 송범데 라세 뱀족강라 유지리 모동 반친 때니 무스직 그때니 다 거랑 그때니 무스직 나라 때니 팁 급주 고진도 다다 빠tun시야 때라 때니 팁 침보데 때 다른 때때 총총 말에 팁 침보데 때니 다 급주 고지 던진도 때인데 때니 잠발랑가 때니 미스직 그때니 다좀 그때니 좀 망슈 잡라 조요리 던지지 때니 때 잠바 촐라 때니 라마 잠바 촐라 teni tenji mambu yo sate kumborita yena teni bods tip smshi thamba tem nyeshi thamba o tenji yonkenda pe haleba mambore teni ndinga sola pecha taya de pe mambore rite yena ta nga so ta mathavna teni pecha tenji mambo yo na teni ya chirantang me ban rawo teni changrawo tenji ndinga so 뱀조 강간나라 용니 teni pe lok jawya ta teni namjin nga so teni pecha taya de nguni pe karchimbore zambalandi thola teni te murg sosola chaparndu te murg kashi te pe halepa pecha tangeng murg tendindu e kashi te yang teni pecha halepa martang tendindu teni aya ta tendi yinda ngarang so yinda teni pecha halepa tangeng tendi she gozina te zakabore rede ta halepa teni pecha martang te shinyang mare pecha ta gondu renchi so yinda pecha ta gondu ti nani jang ngarang so teni pokemon teni pecha te la tana teni tirub nishi tsakchi baga nangla tonna yang teni nga su pecha ga mangdun tisu po tarung jili dang teni par tisud garn ruwan rawo teni tsawa le rekomandu tarung nga sundi nangla tsowa ga thokda teni lega ga thokda teni mi kansho ga thokda teni tisu ga thokla tangrab ga teni shisongdi nangla goya ta rantang chan mangbondu teni na teni pecha taya di pe kashimbore.
So an example of one prolific writer in Tibetan history would be Wodong Panchen, whose collection is probably housed in this library. Over the course of his life, he wrote 94 major books, and this isn't counting the smaller things that he composed. And whilst he's an example of an exceptionally prolific writer, and it's rare to find lama or authors as prolific as him, nevertheless there are many lamas in Tibetan history who composed 30 or 20 books or texts over the course of their lives. So there are many books for us to read. However, if we are not able to read them, then they don't have much value. So it's important to be able to come to a space like this library, and to be able to read the books. There are quite significant differences between different peoples in the world. Some peoples in the world really adore books and the culture of books, whereas others don't so much. As for us Tibetans, maybe to say that we are really the most book captivated, maybe we're not the most. On the other hand, we're also not the least. Actually, being somewhere in between would be quite okay particularly for young Tibetans today. Indeed, among our legacy of books, it is certainly not the case that none of them are relevant or have relevance to our culture in contemporary 21st century society. There is much among Tibetan writing that has vast relevance to all aspects of contemporary life.
근데 가서 다다 실당 가서 볼라든지 이게 배자 만본도 배자 만본 다다 양들이 만보진도 다다 만보더니 야 짜소다 든지 쉬어요 다다 파트너신도 배자 대한 만보도 통용 건도 다 옛날에 대해서 담제 보가서 쪼ging 것들이 삼로다 쪼ging 거 추다 대소리 대마도 봐요 다릅 것들이 살아와서 되나요 말이 대인디 되니 다릅 것에서 가서 되니 보거든이 망초건 소화당 되니 내가 할리바 담보 용큰 연담당 가서라 요군큰 된지고 납쇼거든이 되거든이 배나 거리 소쪽고 콜라이나레 된다와서 그때 배남 초땡 그 콜라이나레 다들 콜라 십샤사로 콜라 배나 총거를 바 콜라이나레 대 망보즈도 근도 대 망보 요나 되니 대소 가서 들이 보고 가이 그 돌았다 다르다이나 미어 말이 카펠레 페 공부를 공부 마토 바면도 대인디니 대소 탐지보다 가서 팔라 겨야 되라 상로 땅고를 마토 바다 가서 ರಂಗ ಕಾಯಿ ತೆ par torne te ni kai jamba ka tone tel hojon sheguna te tela pe khabore te ni tela nyengkha mambondu te na te ni nga so rang kai ka tone hojon chia ta taya ti thola bason chap go re te indi te thola nga so da mambo par girgo ndu pe na nga so ngama lo tong chak chi gongla te ni nga so 디 값스 때니 이기르시거나 따르다가 때니 락찬라원들이 짐춘라원들이 락차약 보여 말에 때니 야거다 때론 로고나 때니 따따라원 좀 이렇게 돈이 때니 갈래 가보래 디 값스 때니 가서 다 보거디 미망보 야거라 때니 로고래 야르 자탐반도나 마르 쳬탐바용한다고 때니제 야미한테 제거래 야거양 디 값스 때니 추 돈라더니 야가양더니 야가라 망본로야래 야르 잔도나 마르 지마도 바통고요 말에 고란소야 내가서 못 봐요 된다 버리 가서 라마서 남트르나라타나 망보요래 되니 라마서 망보티 야가라 차바침보리 되니 티캅스 되니 트스틴단도서 야보요 말에 데 차디더니 망보즈 야가란도네 야가니 시어더니 라마 망보 시어래 로자바 망보 시어래 까블리 망보 야요래 티톨라 보거더니 girzi longshon mambo tanyore tenrishiore te tenri kable mambo latini teni rigni phasum sobatini ta jagarni mar lenni teni tenrizre te lo tongchak da tenriz ka thola teni ngaso je bobi chapsi ka thola teni jinjaran ramra mambo shongare teni pamjur ko thola jarwa mambo shong ena rigni te teni de gimsanji teni lo tongchak da chila teni bobazina tarong teni ndoi khamsam chama Shibashini Dayawati Riniti Latini, then he did the
So at the moment there is a lot of work being done to print Tibetan texts and to print Tibetan texts from the past. Most of these tend to be traditional, related to religion, and so in the books that we have available to us today, there isn't a great deal of them that deal with contemporary or modern life and modern areas of knowledge. So particularly areas that have relevance to the direct relevance to the lives of ordinary Tibetans, such as environmental protection, health and hygiene, business and economics, etc., and many other spheres. We have a lack of books in the Tibetan language on these topics. They're very rare. And so it's important that we really work to translate this kind of material into the Tibetan language. Some might say that we can do so in other languages, but there is great danger in abandoning our own language to study these forms of knowledge in another language. So it's important that it be translated into the Tibetan language, that when we study these things, we do so in our own language. 1,000 years ago, back when the technology that we had at our disposal was nowhere near advanced as it is today, communications and transport were far from developed, many Tibetans undertook very arduous travels to India. Often 100 people would depart and only 10 would return. And we know about their very arduous travels from the biographies of lamas. We know that it was very hot in India, that the hygiene conditions weren't good, and so a lot of people died en route. It was very difficult journeys that people undertook indeed. And so a great many lamas and translators died in the process of going to India. they also spent a great deal of material wealth on these travels, and what their primary purpose was and what they actually succeeded in doing was bringing back to Tibet a very splendid culture from India. And although over the time that has passed from then until now, the political fate of Tibet and the economic situation has gone through many periods of change. It's ultimately this Tibetan culture that has endured over a period of 1,000 years that has formed the backbone for the ongoing survival of Tibetan culture.
Tani dirab te mga sa bogo lorji ke tola na tani rini shelo ko rini nanjin shi pi tani dirab ja halipa ga tani ngan yo mamnyo wa tani ke dirab zre te tikap sa tani rini mambo nanjin shi ni rini pusum so ba tani re song tani ti jini tani parchi lo tong chak chi tani zga rang la shetang tani rini mambo shelo ni tani chi nanjin kala kansum she anda oda tani yore ta yena tikam jabo shomadu tikam yo mari ti jini teni tata la thakson teni tirab nishi tsakshik pa teni nde teni ngai samlo ta nga so yang rigni nangren shi pi teni tirkab ni pa teni zila tengunzun she go re.
So this first period, when a huge amount of new knowledge and cultural information was imported to Tibet from foreign places, this period 1,000 years ago was unprecedented in Tibetan history. And even though after this period, of course, there was still some importing of knowledge from outside places, it wasn't to the extent that took place during this particular period. So from really that period up until now, we can consider ourselves now to be in a second major period of importing new knowledge and cultural information from outside now in the 20th and 21st century.
Tari kaptela nga so tini ta tangrab ka tini rigne mambo tini nanjin tini shego itirkab tini zre te na tini nanjin shia ga tini nipa nga so la yore nge samlo ta nga so tini nipa ndu country region na tini per na shelo la yena nga so tini ta poker tini jonki tani lopta hali pachim bon zambolong lopta ang tangbo cho no ni thongken tini yang mambon du tini gan chanthombo me na sherdane nga so tini ta nashok ne yabo shinken tini inji tang so yabo shinken boy yang pe yabo shinken tini jonki hali ba mambon du de yore tini teso tini nga so tini rigni nanjin shinken ka tini de dekak tini so chigre tini nangla tini nga so pok nangla yena tani yang inji shinken들이 여여래 레데다 망슈티 tini 다 야이기 약보시고 여래 티포그 나라 야이기 약보시고 여래 tani 보이기 약보시 야이기 다 보이니까 약보신ken 것한테 할리바 mam보리 보그 나라 대인디 페나 야이기 돌아야나 따따야나 tani 납쇼거르니 파르치와데 야이기 돌아 tani girja 여래 납쇼라 tani 뎁치고나 tani 람상 girinrogore tini yana Taiwan ga girinrogode yana tini janak kamsa chimbo nala girinrogode gangstar tini nurshokore ma chishu jai ga thola tini girja yore tini yendi ti nani tini ngachola goya tiso tini jai ga thone boy ga thola girna yang gir chochong rawo tini yore tini yendi nge samlo tana ngacho tarta tini korkup tini halepa ga tini korkup ni yapo tini zu tini yong yore tini na sangma ga tini de korkup te latta ni tini ngacho bo rang rigni 펀섬 소바 시야가 되니 고급 디급니빠 딘디즈라 되니 때 문준시 고리 딘디즈라 문준시니 되니 가서 로통 taksik다 심자가 공라 되니 공소 되니 가서 되니 다 할리바 르니 되니 방주 되니 침보서 전여리 조진리 되니 디릅데라 되니 가서 사마가 바팔라 되니 되니 다 당럽 거르니 돼요 펀섬 소바즈 야르스턴 고리 대전야라 참말라 샘식요 고리 샘식요 나가라서라 니식 내상로다는 누상도 다티 포비존기 만분도 그래서 상마티니 르니가 찬 통보리 다롱 마옹발라 맞소티니 보바가 시조거나라 르니가 찬 통보 용캔데 제뇽란 조사 마링이 상근도 지시나 제이망도리 셜로라양티니 테 미망분도 테니 테소 상마가 테 로종다 테소 토라 소소 밤조르다 간가 탈라이나 차킨 칼레칼레 제망 제상조리 제상조나 내가 소양티니 지 모르기 잠반다고 시니 테니 로타 침보 lobta yakshun de sogna la teni ro thab gre teni yina rini ga teni da chi maung ba la teni jemthun ro gire teni re sona teni nga so rini mambo nangjin shi na teni nangjin shi bi kor kum ni ba hale ba ya boz res nge teni sam ge yo teni sem shi yo go ndu teni shi sona teni nga so nga ma rini ya yo jorgin ge rini yo tarta rini yo ni ka pasum so ba re na teni nga so 머르긴 데라 이나양 지금 람보즈라 되니다 네 탑야다 되니 소소 강이나 소소랑 그르니 까이 그 돈에 되니 샷탑바 드립탑바 딘디즈 레용 거래 테페 같이 버리 삼가도
So, in this second great period of importing knowledge from outside into Tibet, I really believe that we have the capacity to be able to do so. At present, there are many young Tibetans outside Tibet attending, some of them attending the best schools in Western countries, and even those who may not be at the best schools. There are an extraordinary number of people who are very familiar and conversant with Western culture, with English and the Tibetan language. And so this group of people will be very important in doing the job of translating this information, this new knowledge into Tibetan. So this is one important group, that is Tibetans, particularly young Tibetans who are currently outside of Tibet. And then on the inside Tibet, whilst there might not be so many people who are fluent and in English, there are a great many people who are fluent and conversant in Chinese and Tibetan. Many people who know both of these languages very well. These days, Western culture or Western knowledge, Western books are widely translated into Chinese, whether it be in mainland China or in Taiwan. Many Western books are almost as soon as they come out in English are very rapidly translated into Chinese. So I feel that this is presents itself as an excellent opportunity for us to translate much of this important information from Chinese into Tibetan. This is something that we can do, and it is something that by doing we will be able to enrich Tibetan culture in this second period of bringing new knowledge and new information to Tibetan culture. So if we see the first period of introducing new knowledge to Tibet as having happened over 1,000 years ago, we can look at this as a period that really built up our traditional cultural treasury in Tibet. And at the same time, we can look at the contemporary situation, this second great opportunity, as one where we bring a great deal of new modern information into Tibet. And this is something that we need to really work hard on. We need to have make a great deal of effort in terms of doing. I have no doubt that the number of educated Tibetans in the future will only continue to increase, and that the number of young Tibetans attending good schools and receiving very good educations will continue to grow in number. And so for this reason, we have a really excellent opportunity right now. It's a great chance, and it should be recognized as such, to be able to translate and to bring a great deal of new information into the Tibetan language. And by doing so, we will be able to create a situation where we have traditional knowledge, we have modern knowledge, and having access to both of these knowledges and cultures in our own language will enable our culture to flourish for a long time. And this is very important.
tani ngama yenda nga so jagarni tani yigir mamboshi ore tarni te sobe hali baga yamboshi ni jingir tini te shiore jingir shini te kaps ngame ngar ka tini tojing ka tini ta jonte so na la yenda tani kono so tsipe sho tanya ta te so changma tani chigba rapori pena nga so te nga so karsang yo sheyem pena je chung ga ba tani amdoni tani penan jamgun sarcha panjita tani wesangni ri tenda ozu ke penanga so jamgun mapam rand so tani kocho kham shogla ri rite ina mism ko tani kocho chomik la tana 내가 저 자완이 되니 내 암도 연사래 내 감쇼고 먹을 쥐바린도 내 외상 금액을 쥐바린도 삼바 자완이 고야요 말 정말 직반라고 직바 식장라고 되니 징기르들 다니 배셨다야라 되니 할리바가 되니 징기르든지 대 나기니 겁나 되니 그 빠야들이 징기르 약보수 시장도 되니 디 점선이 되니 가서 디 지라에 나타 가만 가서 다다 조진 그 되니 배차도 로나 내가 저 팁직 나니 가서 망측직 되니 약보수 시티 돈도 시차나 되니 팁 야통 첨범 가리즈 로나 디낭라요 바오 다티 대량레 삼반다고 소소고와 렌장나 데 직결신이 저저요레 데데인디티니 팁직 나라 양 젤룩 만다와 치치 양 잠바식 나라 양 젤룩 만다와 치치 디 뇨타 mambo 딘디드 자와네 데 문두 아마 옛날 딘디시저요레 디 gemsen지 되는 가서 로종신근 졸라 이기르신근 로종신근 데 로츠신근 참마라데니 람카 할리바가데니 야보데니 시저요레 딘디 데 로지가 돌라 딘디스레 딘디 인디티니 다 따따 가서 딘디 다 디카보니 파텔라테니 아르니 가서 난든시 디카텔라 yang tenja boza nga sola tene chigir chine ota tarnin dri pesha tang gore tarnin dri se gore za tene chigir z tenga so inda manda tene yor gore ma to ba te mena tene nga so pena rigni na den shena de ngaranga samsandra boshin igir e khyoranga samsar de chi mi chi soso go tene samlo manda wa tang tene tarnin manda pesha tang tene ji da tene jima nga so lomnir shinken sola yang pe kable khabore lotru shinken sola pe kable khabore perlo shinken sola kable khabore tene khabore ndong te indi te nga so tene jingir ge tene tsumjutsu indamanda gore te pena nga so khangba jab gona 당보 가서 강바가 기차고 그래 강바가 기차 소박고 그래 소박 요나 되니 소박 찍어 돌아 찍으자네 되니 짱ren도 그래 짱 요나 되니 짱가 돌아 짱 판나 되니 강바 렌도 그래 대인디 톰을 가서 강바 잡야라 당보 강라 삼로 땅고 당보 강바라 삼로 땅지야 말에 당보 기차라 삼로 땅고 그래
So to begin with, in the first period of Great Translation, when there was great effort to translate terminology from Indian scriptures in a standard way, in a uniform way. And this led to a situation where later in Tibetan history, scholars and masters such as Je Tsongkhapa and Sakyapandita and Jumipam, despite coming from despite existing in different periods of history and coming from different places, when we read their compositions, it's not possible for us to say, oh, this is written by someone from Amdo, or this is written by someone from Kham, or this was written by someone from Central Tibet. The reason being that they are using a standardized language and using terminology that is standardized, that is uniform. And this created a great situation for those who came after them, whether it be students or teachers or readers, upon being familiar with a term, familiarizing oneself with one word in one context, then one would be able then to go and understand this book in understand this word in when reading many other books, whether it be in 100 further books or 1,000 further books, knowing the words, because they were used in a standard sense and their meanings were set in a standard sense, gave great convenience and ease to readers and students and scholars. So it wasn't the case that they were all using different words and using words in an inconsistent way with inconsistent meanings. So that was the situation in the past. Now, in the situation where we are today, we are also really needing to approach the translation of new knowledge into Tibet with a standardized approach to words. We have a great need for this. The reason being that if we don't take a standardized approach, or we don't seek to create a uniform vocabulary, then everyone who translates something will simply do so according to their own idea of how something should be translated. And this will create a situation of great inconsistency and difficulty for future students and teachers and readers. And so it is for this reason that we decided it was very important to create a dictionary of standardized words, of standardized modern vocabulary. And we can liken this to building a house. When we set out to build a house, the first thing we need to do is contemplate the materials, the bricks, and we need to craft the bricks one brick at a time. And then after we've done so, we can make a wall, and then after having erected the walls, put on the roof. When we start out, we don't first think of the house as an entirety. We've got to start off at the basic unit of the raw materials we need to build the house with.
teni nga chu teranga teni jorjita ta nga chu teni chungju ko la teni yin song song te na nga chu ti chu mongbo zmen ta ka tar nge chungju ko la teni deshit teni nyonyong zu teni gyap ko changma la ngochun nyonyong su she yin.
So the topic for tonight's talk was really introducing my work on this dictionary. We don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to briefly introduce this work to everyone.
teni nga chu chungjun de teni ta leni ta talo ne nga chu lo longkhur chchik ri song longkhur chchik rang la teni nga chu lekan de leni teni mi mambo z ka lekan leni teni lo re la teni chod mambo chona nga chu korma ji teni chokoyo nyonyong ko kas lo re la teni thang nire teni chokoyo teni thang re la nyema chwanga teni da sheka chokore da sheka rang la teni te samanyam든 somni teni chokore teni gunin choni teni talo parta teni ta lo chchik teni resong.
So we've been engaged in this work for 11 years now. Many people have been involved in this project. In terms of, we do it by convening meetings to work on the dictionary. In some years, we've had as many as 4 meetings per year. At other times, 2 meetings per year. And at every meeting, we convene for a period of 15 days.
tani thomar nga chu teni chungjo zoya te kandi gone teni samsung te jimsung kandis gone teni sambare zena teni shetang nga chu te lo chakha teni z gongla te mi mambo teni ta porker yak pojam ma shiwa chi ta nga chu pena changma ga teni chowa ga na la shia de na ngama ga teni pena yangli ko la na shigli ko la na mambo z te mi mambo namgin teni sha de ya de ngama ga ti sore ngama lo mambo ko te je teni inna nga chu teni ngama ga teni yoshi te so tamche ponen chowa ga na la kale chama me pa chaso be jana rongba z la na teni ngama nga chu teni ner nga ya teni igpa ga teni ner dong ya teni yang choma ga na la ni teni long la sharia teni droa ga na la teni te unzat ya teni yang teni ne so teni ngo chi te chimchik na la tak zambashi teni zo zajiren do re teni ti nang te la teni mambo z tambo ne ngana zora ngar go re te dawaz ke teni yang teni ne dona igba ga dong re ten da boz ke ne sharna shara ga teni long la sharna teni shigre te chama me ba chakson chama trchar re son teni mambo z tere son de teni ne ngana mambo z ka mambo z lan trchar ndo yo re mambo z teni re son teni ndo ka se teni 디 타니 때서 사마양 배시 메바르서 사마 가마시아 때서 사마 다 구바 메바든지서 데닌 초아가 나라 사와 mam보즈 렙송 데니 디 사와 때서는 가서 망치게요 말이 데닌 트샤 페나 가서 네 동야건 트샤텔라 가리스고 하고요 말이 너야 데니 네 롱라 샤라가 롱커 데니 양 텔라양 가리스고 고 말이 디 거런가 찍보고 망신한 적이 아마 디나라 mam보 따롱 mam보 살락 mam보즈도 티 솔라 가리즈고나 티 망티 시게요 말이 데 마시티 데니 참에 포크 잡삼나요 데니 잡탑고요 말이 지그리 니리 되니 가서 ngamat자와니 메피티니 양 뭐보 몽보스 되니 가서 소화가 날라더니 스타트더니 lep송 되 고데 대체 그 자세 담바글로니 다 고존에 되니 가서 소화가 날라 사람 뭐보사람 몽볼렙 차버더니 니통 선출니 되니 소화가 날라 뭐보사람 몽볼렙송 때 베르나드니 저 짐처 거 거리 자와 거리 되니 전통 가버 거 거리 근데 몽보즈 되니 소화가 날라 레버리 되니 소화가 날라는 뭐보는 되니 랩차리어리 이나 망니요 말에 되니 인디 되니 가서 되니 망 마고디 되니 자마가 때때라 가서 법이 랑가 잡아서 지녀요 말에 되니 메디 되니 다 가서 오니 가서 까때 가서 소화가 날라더니 배쇼 땅 쳐야지 뇽뇽뇽뇽 좀 막도 봐 매바착대 잠바 삼바 배쇼 땅기 매야 연담만다 까다 잠바 배쇼 마땅나더니 다 매바착네더니 다 가서 니 나라더니 소화가 날라이나 파르체더니 지 샤와트는 웅부 차버도 웅부 있나 땅아 다리코나 샤바데 가서 당럽 장거더니 겸상스근 소화가 날라상로 땅나 망보스도 당럽 장거더니 졸리 le thombi dini ta ta ngobo tin ri de ore te te so samala ta mang ngama meti te sarwa go ore te sarwa te meti teni sama go te kadya machine teni pha leba bok ka te teni peshu nyonyo so ma to pa me pa teni zi chaso ta lo teni changa ya ma teni ko kongla.
So, in terms of the reason why we felt it necessary to do this dictionary work was that about 10 years ago there was a prevalent situation in Tibetans where Tibetans really weren't speaking Tibetan very well. Or using Tibetan very well. Essentially, many of traditional practices had disappeared from Tibetan life with the arrival of modernity and its conveniences. So traditional ways of doing things in farming lifestyles and nomadic lifestyles had slowly ceased to be, and as this happened, the vocabulary and the words that went with these lifestyles and ways of doing things also stopped being used as well. They had no use in a situation where these kinds of practices and lifestyles were no longer being continued. So an example would be the milling of barley. The traditional milling of barley is traditionally involved a process of drying and threshing and hulling and grinding the grains using traditional tools, and there were implements and there were words for all of these things. However, when this process became mechanized, when there became machines available to do this work, then simply these words just simply went out of use. And people didn't know the names or the words for them. So even in this situation, even if people wanted to use Tibetan, they weren't able to do so in a situation where new things had arrived that they didn't have a name for. And so many of these new things were not just machines, new kinds of farming machines and other machines that are used in a nomadic context, but also in everyday life. Beginning in the 1980s, but certainly hastening by around the year 2000, computers, the internet, mobile phones, etc. These were all new things that were becoming very common in Tibetan areas, and yet there were no names for them. So household items, essentially things that were made in factories, because there were no names for them in Tibetan at this situation, people were not using Tibetan names because there weren't ones for them at the time, and therefore Tibetan language use had become quite endangered.
teni te chiri teni pogu mambo pogu chonso porque tsawani jammashiwa teni she yang phama chola yang khashila torna me pata yang khashi torna yona yang teni ta jabgona yang sarwati sola jawe meti teni kandishe go hama ko teni she ni teni nyen khape nyem kha 잡침보스 되니 제바제다 상마 삼로도는 되리나 가속까지 머랑와 다 욕반 메파 착서를 삼바더니 그더니 다 네서든지 강라더니 특거리.
So, in terms of young children too, there were many children who really couldn't speak Tibetan. In some cases, it was their parents not paying much attention or concerning themselves with it. In other cases, where parents were concerned, nevertheless, not knowing any better themselves, they weren't sure how to go about addressing this situation. So we really felt that we'd arrived at a point where Tibetan language was severely endangered and perhaps on the precipice of falling into extinction.
되니 때 지레 때 정말 하고 그래. 되니 니 때니 나랑 그 되니 다 인담만단 욕보 되니 다 증주조 거야 삼바 되니 삼로데 절단티 갑네 되니 조진 조소노 조지 되니 레소나 약보레 삼데 되니 삼데요. 되니 갑식 되니 나랑 하사라 손에 하사가 되니 때 남주탕니 파르더니 하사가 파르더니 시슐랑코르 되니 그 나라 손바요. 다 디디가위나 다타단다 말이 다타이나 가서 하사가 남주탕니 하사란로구나 카르마 집지 담바더니 그 돈적으로 디캅스이나 되니 람카양 되니 약보 말을 되니 랑코리양 약보 말이 지속시다 시카 되니 고르 되니 지속시다 시카 고디 된 가랑 때 랑코티나라 되니 소는 치디라 되니 보비 버서니도 때 고라니 야나글라 로종시니 되니 야용근 걸 홈마지 되니 젠도 고라니 그때니 가자 샤근도 네 가자 때라더니 냐연 네 지속시다 시카 라더니 담보 가딘 랑코나라 되니 parle masung ko warda tini nge khwani khabda dila nge nyani soyen ngen chi dilan de tini khwani khabda mambo shani tini shesong ti nangla nge zabzu shini nyani shogdum zu jabong ti nangla parchi ti kaja ti gema jimpena tini ti nani chik rabozu tini da ta porke yensari de ma to ba jamba tsama tini ka jamba jamrong de ko mambo ti nangla sini tini 드리시니 다 porque ngoma tinala parchidini jacha nishi tsa ni tsa tindi yonamena tindis mato tsawani mendu ta nge samsung tini tande korang mo ni mare te nga so lobtang nala yong ngol ma chaman diji je ngdo tan dindi shina tini nga so ta dindi jine tini tarong te jana te penin ka chim bore sare samne tini nga so chungzo tim gyobo tini zo gong de samne tini zoya ga tini konglong te tin gos gre te deso tamje bong arang ga 때 좀지요 띠좀디 갑상라 되니 보기가 이르든 냠수 시급이 거기더니 삼스르야 되니 요리 디나랑의 참마 주저요 되니 나가서 충주조야 그더니 삼로디 되니 고니 되니 쇼와 되니 그래.
So this situation where the Tibetan language was in danger is something that probably everybody knows. And at this time, I really felt that quickly working on a dictionary and bringing a new dictionary. Bringing it out, bringing it into publication would be a very good thing. There was one time about 10 years ago when I visited Lhasa, and as I was in the bus heading from the airport to the city, that's a trip that these days takes about 40 minutes, but back then, because the road wasn't very good and transport was fairly average too, the trip took about 1.5 hours. So during this trip of 1.5 hours, I was sitting beside two young Tibetan boys who had been studying in China, and they had returned to Lhasa. And as I listened to their conversation for this period of 1.5 hours, I was struck by the fact that they were constantly mixing Chinese words with their Tibetan, such that really only 1/4 or 20% or perhaps 25% of the words they were using were Tibetan. And I thought to myself, this is probably not just a case of two people. This is probably a prevalent situation among many young people. And so I felt that this was a situation where our language and our language use was very much in danger, and that it was necessary to work fast to do something about this, and to work fast on bringing the dictionary into publication. So this was my beginning motivation, and I've actually composed. I wrote an article on this. Which the article was about my thoughts on the need for preserving and reviving Tibetan language. So this is how it all began.
Tani di kapsa tani nga so bobala tsumzu jamba mere wajenda te mare nga so la tsumzu mambundu jabarda tartanda yana tsumzu sama domjana tani nishi sumchi jibji tani yosare chichi chongchong sama shir domjana tani yore tata ti nala nga so namjin tani pesho tangdeya te mi mangchi shugo pesho tang te tsumzu ni pesho tangare nga so pe tsama ga tani lagla yoya te tani zire ti nala chikte nga so tani ta 보자 춤주 쳔보세 그래 대배 가서 춤주 참아가는 약슈리 대대다 가서 따라 로지가 돌아 요비 춤주 속나니 춤주 약슈데리 보자 춤주 쳔보레 대 dunken데서요 가서 보고 가마슈 쪽 양바 감네 용큰 쾌바데서 되니 주요리 된지 인디 되니 약슈데리 보자 춤주 쳔보레 디나라 단위 추수 주요리 단위 추수 적다 되니 학생도 대배 약보레 무슨 소바리 다 있나요 되니 다가 Korang layang teni kyun chik yuwa de kangrezina te tanya te sama surjing ka tanya takda mato yuwa mare surjing ka tanya takda kare te mato ba jamba manduk teni jamba kashi yuwa de rini sarjinra teni kapsa teni shongwi tsik sarwa teni kashi yuwa re mato ba jamba tishi shongwa chik janga mare te korang ka kyun re shetang te pe yakbo shik re.
So this is not to say at the time that there were no other Tibetan dictionaries or bilingual Tibetan dictionaries. Looking at the situation now, there's probably upwards of 20, 30, 40 Tibetan dictionaries. Of these at the time, there were two that were the dictionaries that were mainly used. The first being the Tibetan Chinese Great Dictionary. Historically speaking, this is the best Tibetan or Tibetan Chinese dictionary, and it was compiled by excellent scholars from the old society, and it has about 10,000 word entries. So generally speaking, this is a really very good dictionary. Its one shortcoming is, however, that the words contained in it are traditional. They're all traditional words. There are no new words or modern words except for perhaps a few that were new terminology that was added during the Cultural Revolution era. So this is a shortcoming of this dictionary.
Tani nipaade there's jachishunda ote kangrezina tani yang jabut tsungju chimboja tani jiyore jabut tsungju chimboja teri tani tinala tarni teze mambore tarni chuso jida laziyore tarni chuso jida lazundu ta inna yang te yang garang tani ditso ka wanda shina tani ta lorob dunchi bagnala ta terim nyeshi bag tani lorob dunchi bagnala mi mamboz ka lene tani dunchi bagam jik tani gachi bagam gola tani patron shewa tani zuri di nangla yang tani yang rini sarji da tichu korku tsik mambo halipa mambo yori ta rini sarji gzina ti kab ku tsik takdak zi umare shertang ti yanchu ka tani tsik te lor danchi yanchu ka tsik te mambo ti nangla yori yena tani gashi sanju ka tsik te yang te zi nyong re nyong re ti nangla gashi sanju ka tsik yang jini yar kanun gyamne yori ta yena ti tola tani yang mambo zi mandu te yena tani di nangla te shirtang tsik mambo yore te yena te korang la tani kyun mambo haliba kyun mambo re kyun mambo te so di nangla yongkang ka te tarnya mambo zi tani nga so tsik da mang da tani rabuchi ya mare pena jayi ka thone tani sar jirna halam korang rishit rabu jamni o korang ka tani rirwan rabuchi ni ta pena jayi ka tani mang tsik tani zi yona tani te poyi ka thola jir sawi kapsa tani rishit rabu mato ba tani korang mang tsik ngoma zi ya mare te yongkang te yore te yena mambo zi tani ri kyun chik te te ri tani kyun ni te kang yore zina tani lor jashi pa sinchuni ti sinchuni shungkang ka tani yang ubo mambo ti nala ya mare ti jashi pa sinchuni shungkang ka yang ubo mang tsawane me pada mare yore ta yena te mambo zi manduk te indi tani ti nala yang tani pena 자위 거다오다 teni chi khabar changtong ko korda chimchul ko korda da shiso ko tola ngerwa mambun ro yore teni yang shiso ko tola ngerwa mambun ro di yang shawa yang sarwa mambu yung gore ti shawa ti so manda ti so yang ti nang la yo mare teni yin di yang kwarang la tai ti nang dong ke chane yang teni yang chi shitang tsing mambu ji yore ta yang chama sang wan ra wo ta yang sir girya ga tola yang na to mambu zo to teni zire.
The other major dictionary in use at the time was the Great Chinese Tibetan Dictionary, and this was a large dictionary in terms of its the number of its word entries. It had around 100,000 words. It was compiled during the 1970s and finished towards the beginning of the 80s and published at this time. So this dictionary contained a lot of words from, well, not just the Cultural Revolution era, but from the 1970s in general. The words that originated during the early 80s, there are a few, but also there aren't many from this period of either. So the word entries in this dictionary were dated. So despite the fact that it was a large and major dictionary, it had many shortcomings. One shortcoming was the fact that many of the words were explained almost rather than finding a new term for a word that was translated. So a Chinese word, when translated in Tibetan, it was more like it was explained or defined rather than a single word chosen to represent the word properly. So that was one shortcoming. And then the other shortcoming, as mentioned, was the fact that when this dictionary was composed, there were many, or when this dictionary was compiled, it was a time when there just weren't so many new material things in society. By no means was there the internet or modern telephone communications, the computer, etc. In the period since this dictionary was compiled, society had undergone a great deal of change, and so we needed new words to represent this change. But the content of this dictionary was lacking, yes, despite the fact that this dictionary had a very large number of word entries, its shortcomings were also fairly significant as well.
Teni tsumzu tela, teni tsumdruk shi bikapsa teni yang korang la teni kyon hali pa chimbo shik yori. Te kang rezi na pena danga so mi mambo zika kono koso gosha jabne teni tanyi te so rikrik shi ne teni leo yori. Te pena ngaranga teni tanyi tong so shik teni yang mo jamba zika tong so shik teni nga so mi mambo zika teni mi rega teni tong so chiri na bo shi ne teni tanyi mambo zi yigir shi. Teni te shi tsari jini te so tamsi nyamda teni par teni tsumzu drikn jogaya ma thokba te nyamda teni keryo ne nga so mi mambo go dholang shi dan driknduk dan drikn munduk zaya teni dholang da shi ya ma re. Te ma shi pi jimsen ki teni ti thola teni yang ching garwan rata yang chi te par yang kyardun rata teni pa mambo ritam. Teni indi teni te tsumzu ngoma teni tsardan zikanalan rogo na teni ro thoku ma re ta. Teni zingin sarti teni nga so 대지 살든다고 된데 그때니 충조주 조고근데 그제니 내가 저때 충조도 조기 된 건적 바래 건적이야 됐더니 니 동아가로라 되니 니 동아가로 되니 시카다가 방나라더니 건적아래 일단 띠공라더니 로스지그 니 공라 내가 저때 충조조야 답시가 돌아 상로당에 잡직만 보시니 되니 우슬레까 건적이야 돼 되니 동아가로네 되니 건적 바래.
In addition to these problems, there was also the editing process of this dictionary was also problematic. That is, the way that they did the translation of the words was to divide the words among different editors or different translators and give everyone, say, 100 word entries to translate. So they did this independently. People were not coming together and discussing how to go about translating the words, and because of this, there was it ended up that there was quite a bit of inconsistency between the ways and the principles that upon which words were translated, and contradictions or inconsistencies. So for this reason, this dictionary couldn't be considered a standard dictionary. And so we felt that there was a need for a dictionary of standardized words, of uniform standardized words. So our work on our dictionary commenced in 2005, in the spring of May in 2005. We had done quite a bit of research and preparatory work before this, but our actual work in terms of beginning to translate the terms began in 2005.
Teni ngatsu tsumzo tata leang gotsgne teni ta lorela teni chondo mambon chone teni leka yo teni indi ngatsu bog nane teni na jinkhen tela teni lasa ta teni chongon ta ngatsu kamga teni mdoi kamsumgo teni ta changma teni shori meba teni teni pewyori teni nala teni te ngatsu jangga yang parchirin da bonda boshine lasa ga teni mjangda amdo mjangda teni kamshok mjang raboshine teni nala teni yonggoyori teni nala teni mambozu teni ngamaga teni da je ringne pe yakbo yongkeng je jiba tesore teni yang mambozu ta sark teni yang ngatsu je lobra chimo girgun jada teni girgun chemo jada yang na ji teni ngatsu lekhong nala je yigjerda so tola leka lenkeng yang teni ngatsu bog nala katnika yakbo shinke teni teni korwa teni yang inji teni shola yang teni shinke yang teni kashi ori te mai nam me jamba chama ka niri te yakbo shinke mo damga shine teni lorega nala ta chondun soko yore teni chondun sobi kapsu sherdang aso teni susu go teni girk yore te susu go teni yige mambo gir teni gir sarwi jini teni aso nyamdan chone dawa shekaz garangla teni te jolang mambo shegre tsikchiri shiri tola jolang shegre teni tsikchibo ti teni aso kapsi ti tsikchibo go tola teni ta yin rambo jolang shine teni chizo ni teni ngorroya teni yang te musin rapore 다 춘돔나 아주 니마스직라 때니 레가 때니 추주 get 레거리 니마리리라 디나라 때니 추주 셰카 가도 추주 셰카 슈도 셰카 슈솔라 가소 잡거래 때나 레카 레양 오마티 추주 든라고 때니슬라 가소 레카 레거리 때니 딘디 쓰용디 때니 가소 때니 추주 찍나라 때니 타니더nga 득든 때니 마토바 단조 톱고만데 추조식은 나라데 참마가티 돌아데 가서 디 동거 돌아는 줄담만 양가서 가는 거 존나티 존데보 인담만 어디 잠바당 가르다 મં가르티니 양가서 티니 보고 하마가티니 익차가 나라 딘득담만도 나 딘디가 콜라 맘보 살로타 맘보 돌랑치 딘디시온디 추조식이가 나라 티니 타니 어디니 주든 딘디 마토반 조도 마소 티니 다티 바르다 가서 티니 다 로 직직해서 옛날 다른 추조니 가서 약 무슨 좀요래 다른 추조니 때라 되니 망때 담배시 되니 때라 리시디 약 보잡 되니 신이 되니 다른 추조니 다 가서 로 직직하랑 되니 좀송 되지 마돈 좀요 말에.
So every year we convened several meetings to work on the dictionary, and among our team of translators, we had people from all over Tibet. So people from Lhasa, from Qinghai, from Kham. Approximately, there was an equal amount of people from each area of Tibet, and among our team are some older scholars with a very high level of traditional education and cultural attainment. We also have younger university professors, for example, or workers in the government translation department who have a very high level of Tibetan language knowledge. Everyone has proficiency in two languages, and some people also, there's a couple of people who know English as well. And so the way that we organize the work is that between our meetings, everyone works on terms and translates them. And then when we get together for the meetings, we go through every single word and we discuss the best way to translate it. And sometimes it can be that we spend 1 or 2 hours just discussing one single word. Every day during the meeting, we meet for about 7 hours. in the course of one day, or in every hour, we cover about 5 or 6 or 7 words, no more than this. We talk about things like is the meaning, has this meaning, the meaning of a word in its translated form being properly communicated? How does it sound like? Do we have resources in our traditional vocabulary so to represent a new word? For questions like this, we give much thought and discussion to. So from the time that we began the work until now, 11 years have passed. Over this time, we have translated 20,000 terms. So this 20,000 means that we have decided on a word, a name, a term for a particular new word, and we have also defined it and provided an explanation for the meaning of the word.
Tani tarti parda nga tsu zoya tela tsunzo nga tsu riksum shini tani zuyo tarti parda tsunzo siti nga tsu shirdang nga tsunzo da pore tani tangla tsawa te tsikti tsawi tsikti yore ti tola yige gan repshit gyabni tani ga chigiyo tela tebini te targa ton sarsong te tani te mayamba te tani rimu yo sa tani te rinjir ka tani tsunzo zi tani chigiyo te nga so targa tebni tini ta yo tambo ta ni bo ni yo te tola rmo tini kor yore saman rabar yore teni samba ta nga so tini tarni nyamba kor te la nga so sungzo chizo yo ta te nga so bokum do gi khamsmne sacha mambo ni tini rabar mambo jaw chaka mambo len tini pena bok sacha te tharambo borjung tini ta tani metok jung da wata tani kongbo sacha da dita ngari ta so kor ta so ni mambo te yarong da so mambo ni rabar jamni thanit aso mangso ko na la med jogo yong kan tani thanit projing ka thanit so te shokchi de dini tani te chigle yo tit na la parchi thanit tong to sim da tani yosa yo tani te ta ga so le sar song tani par patron kan la tan ni jang parchi dawa talo lo dilda dumbat yapati rizona thongre teni teni tarni nyangba ko te nyangba tim nyup teni ton da yen ma to te ga so pendam jogba yen na ja da we na ti mem jogba mom bo ta drap ko ya mare teni ja ga thola teni da tarni mom bo yore teni te nyam ro yore ta khashi ge na te nyam ro na ti yo mare je teni zen ken yore ta teni ze mare ga so jni je ti tarni te pe na ja ga thola yonken ge tini tarnyate so riri la tini tarnyate samlo tangna ti riri gan ti jablok la tini yang ringde ta tini yang nga so nga ma ga man nam ji tini mang to sar ta tini korang so samlo tang sar ta tini mambo ti na la tini lojong she andu te changma me ba chak so na te pe phangbo rindu tini indi nga so tini chungju zu zo yo te zo char song te je tini talo lo ti tang la nga so te mayembi jamba ga chungju ni yo chite 냥데니 린저 그 쯤조제 데니 타르니 그 토라 데니 바리요 켄데 지그제 데니 바리 멘켄 지요 데니 촌 dom나 아주 다르가 달로 쯤조 살왔음 통야요 데당 나마 데니 쯤조 지요 데참 탐시 dom장나 아주 데니 쯤조 든 뎁든 요 지지종종 뎁든라고 데니 주소요 옛날 촌장 시데니 데 장가데 다니데 mam보즈 말에 당아서 가시 데니 조진제 같이 당르브리 데니 같이 라버요사 같이 라버베사 딘디 그때 mam보레소레 마토 바시장가 다니니나 다니데니 다 추조니 학든디즈 마토 바다론 루탑 고만데 딘디즈 가서 론도 소나라 데니 레차르송
So we have 3 different kinds of dictionary that we have worked on up until now. The first kind of dictionary is a regular dictionary, one that has word entries with definitions beside them, and we have published 2 volumes of this kind of dictionary of new vocabulary. The second kind of dictionary that we have published is an illustrated dictionary. We've published 2 volumes of this, so there are new terms and pictures accompanying the new terms. And then we have also worked on a third kind of dictionary, and this is a dictionary of old or traditional words in everyday Tibetan life. So in order to compile this dictionary, we gathered together a lot of photos of traditional objects and things from farming and herding life in all over Kham, Amdo and Utsang. Some photos came from as far afield as Gungjo, Ngari and Medok. And so this dictionary contains about 3,000 words. We have completed this work. This dictionary will be published probably in July or August this year. And for example, an example of the kinds of words that this dictionary contains is there's a lot of, for example, words relevant to nomads' yak hair tents. There is a great deal of very detailed vocabulary related to these tents and the parts that comprise them. And because an increasing number of nomads are no longer living in tents, these words are slowly going out of usage. Some people think this isn't a big deal, no problem if we stop using these words, but actually if we think about it, there is so much culture and history behind each of these words, how it came into usage, what the cultural input was in every word, and there's really much for us to learn and to know through maintaining and preserving these words, and it would be a great shame if they were lost. So we have these three kinds of dictionary, the three kinds that I mentioned, in addition to two new volumes of the illustrated form that are coming out. We've produced 6 individual books. However, in terms of the number of actual terms that we've translated over this 11-year period, we've translated 20,000.
Teni ngaso tip deso tanga ina teni ta rimba margu igone teni rimba malimbi gone teni mar teni lobja da teni yigir da teni chi jangja le khong da nyamchen le khong da deso chama la par teni chaya za tip nish tip chuso nish tsar nga tsa teni ngaso rimba margu a cheni chama la teni par chayo re teni mamcho deso yang teni ngaso yang teni kong te zu debo rao shini teni mangso kona la teni tramgo yore teni indi ti mangso kona la ngaso teni ta tepte halepa teni pok nala ina teni kyabja chimbo re tarta ina ngaso tathola mar lenya yore tathola lenya ti nala tayona ti changa ti nala tayona teni pecha tsama nala lenya te ngaso teni tsumzu te lenya te mang chishu rin tuk tathoko mar lenya te la teni nangla ina teni ta mambo halepa mambo te parne teni demper shege yore mangso tsama ga teni ta mang chishu ga teni ti chimla teni ngaso perang ngarang rongbanda tso nalando ni ta de ti parche chimsang re nala te re jang do teni chimsang re nala jag yo pa matsa teni mar ta ni teni nakpo shini teni jang do ta te tsama ga yak bo ta gang do teni mi mambo lo la leng ge yore teni yang mi mambo ga yang te la lo la len ni jiglen ni teni jig yak bon chonken sola zang tak teni yakbo teni takjenda padrejin jenda teni ga shego mambo pekendo teni indi tarta dayena teni mangso kono la teni chabja chimbo re te ngaso yang teni haleba mangso ko teni japchur shewa la ngaso haleba gade yo ngaso semshik da bolemne ota monten ni zona panto yosare yakbo yosare samne teni samde yo samaga japchur pe yakbo sheso samaga nala shikin yakbo ra teso lokashi nala.
So we have provided about 250,000 of these dictionaries free of charge to schools around Tibetan areas, as well as to the government translation departments, broadcasting departments, and television stations as well. And in addition to this number that we've distributed free of charge, we've sold the rest at a relatively cheap price in the Tibetan community. And so the dictionaries have really been disseminated very widely. In addition to the actual hard copies of the dictionaries, they're all available for free download online. And actually, if we look at the numbers of people who are accessing the dictionaries in this way, this is the way that the most number of people are accessing the dictionaries in this downloadable way. The dictionaries have been widely taken up in the ordinary Tibetan community, among farming communities, herding communities. In most houses, there is a copy of the dictionary. In some cases, it's been so widely read that the pages have turned black. In some communities, it's very common for people to memorize the words, and there's an increasing number of new terminology memorizing competitions that are being held, and the winners of these receive prizes. So it's become very popular in the Tibetan community, and we're extremely happy and glad and energized by the support that this work has been given by the community, and it's made us feel that continuing this work has some benefit.
Tani zungzuzoya ga tani rosong teso tamchepo nga sumo kashi zika tani dune tani zoya re tema taba zamba shilong ne yongwa tawa ta yana chik tani zhunga tani chapan rawa tani chi yang mara nga so girka tani tamchepo tani parku yore. Tani yamba tso nga so tinala jinkin teso de girgan teso samba tamchepo yana soso laksam namdak goni yunga yore ma toba koso la lasha chik jang tra goya mara 참마가 학습 남다 거니 용요래 근데 인디 가서 따티나라 용ken 미 망보즈라 페나 로 즉직가 랑라 따코서 페나 레콩고 나라티 야컵고 레콩고 나라 레카 랭켄시나 타니 로치가 나라타 로서크 칼라 갑텔라 코서 가르소테 잡죠래 타니 다와 지발라 타니 야 야컵고 티신츠요래 티 가서 니마 든다오 타니즈 가르소 잡죠 Tindis Matoba Mambo Javkimandu, Tiniti Naso Javia Lekati Samanga Sunzu Legaganala Jane, Legale, Tintita Leore, Tindi Girgan Mambo, the Conso Low Chuchika Rangla, Tiniti Naso to Savani Javjara Mare, Sama Lekata Lene, Tindi Yongore, Sama Lasam Namtakagoni Lekalenkin, Tatari, then Tindi, Tiningas Tindi Goni Lekalene, Tabar the Lesson, the Maum Balangaranga Samlotana Tarangaso, Lokashila, Tini Montani Legio. Ngasu samna tini ngasu tini bol la ina tarta da poina ngasu tanya chuchu sim rawo tini ya pose yo sona di shirtang lan dang ro ndu ta ngasu pena jala ina tarta tini dangrab yarkit tini tsumru tsia tini ziyore to tina la tanya chuchu chig ma to mandu tanya chuchu chig ri ta tin tarta jago tini ji 차 진전상 고마 잡고대 되지 디나 증문도 증마통문도 이나 디나라 디니 양아서 보거이나 거나서 배나 야거니 지보 마도 방아서 남진 배션 마땅한다고 디니 양 측 할레바 만보여리 디니 양 측가시다 디니 돈씩 바임바 측 만보 디니 욕다 만보용 근들이 양도 다 티수 파르디니 표장나 디나라 양 디니 할레바가 만보문도 티수 파르린 조티나 디니 파르치 투소저 디니 나다 디니 연사래 Tindi inati ngacho bol razila samlo tambay na tarta ngacho tini chili go tini jambati parphat te mai ba shirtang ngacho go tini lobcha inna re den rawo zo gna ngacho te mangcho ko na la inna ta chu chongle ran so shirtang ga thola pe sho ta la tini tanyo chu sum rawo tini ma to ba go mandu tini te inna ta ngacho taro maung ba la te le ni tanyo chu sum ra bo tini ga thola tini yar phaya ga tini rewa tini she de yo 다 실당 가서 대랑 내 때니 가서 단위 증조 ngochoshia te titsuko wanga tirisi mato yung kumantik shirtang te nga so lelik ta tiso tola nga so mambo nyamnyong ta tiso mambo shajiyo rita ina ta te mi yang mambo zita nga so chili kondra pore yang mi mambo zita la yang mupa yo na mena ko mare tiso yang mendo te ina ta ngandur di tendisi shaka yin.
So in terms of the funding for our dictionary work, this comes from a few private sources that is put together to enable the work to be done. So it doesn't have any official or government support whatsoever. And in terms of the teachers and the volunteers who have been doing the dictionary work, they all do this work through pure goodwill and altruistic intention. They don't receive any salary or compensation for their work, and many of them have been doing it for 11 years now. So those who have government jobs, they use their holiday time, their vacation time, such as during the New Year holiday or the national holiday in October. At these different times, there is 2 weeks or 1 week's holiday, and they devote this time to attending the dictionary meetings. So these volunteers have really known no vacation or leisure time for the past 11 years. All of their holiday time has been given to the dictionary work. So in terms of our intentions for the future, we think that it makes sense to keep doing it for several years until we have compiled probably 30,000 terms, new terms. We feel that that would probably be sufficient. If we look at the modern Chinese dictionary, it has about 60,000 words in it. However, not all of those words are relevant for Tibetan usage. There are many words of which have a very similar meaning, or other words that are too specialized. Or anyway, if we essentially sift out the words that we don't need and confine ourselves to words that are relevant to everyday usage in Tibetan life, then probably we need about 30,000. So we hope to continue working until we can achieve this goal. In terms of actually our methods of translation and the experiences that we have had during our period of work on the dictionary, there's a lot I could say, and thank you very much for listening.